No matter what action figure line you collect, there's always one figure that you cherish the most because it's the very first figure that started your collection for that specific action figure line. And for me, this White Knight Batman figure that we are looking at today is my very first DC Multiverse figure that I ever bought. And it's the very first figure that started my action figure collecting hobby. And I wanted to take a look at this figure today because it's quite fitting that we are in the month of March. And March of 2020, 5 years ago, was the month that I started collecting DC Multiverse figures. And yeah, so, I just want to do a couple of these throwback reviews and talk about these older figures in my collection. And if you've been following the channel for quite some time now, you know that I like to talk about a lot of old figures that I have in my collection. And of course, sometimes talk about some newer stuff that came out recently. And with that said, let's dive into it, shall we? Let's talk about this White Knight Batman figure. And of course, as usual, let's start with the data profile card. And it is very interesting to be looking back at this because the early data profile cards were printed with a thicker paper material, which they stopped using, I think, after the Arkham Batman. I don't remember which one, but there was one figure that stopped using this thicker material. So, holding this card in my hand for the first time in such a long time, because I've had this thing in a binder for the last couple years, it is very interesting. It feels different. It's not the same as the more recent cards where it's like a thinner material. So it's like very nostalgic. And here you have an image of what the character looks like in the comic book art, right? Pretty cool. And I like the way that, they try to depict it in the same way. And I think they did a really good job capturing that art style in action figure form when this figure came out 5 years ago. Like, it looks pretty spot on in my opinion. So I like that. And on the back, it does say that this is from Batman White Knight. And this is so nostalgic, man. They got rid of a lot of this stuff. Like, back then, they had all this info. Not only did they say the source, where it's from, they also say the real name, the height, and the weight. So it does say that he's 6'2", he weighs 210 pounds. It's so interesting how these cards in the beginning had all the information here for, like, their height and their weight and stuff, but they got rid of it after. And it reads, after years of epic battles between the Dark Knight and his twisted arch enemy, Batman faces his greatest challenge yet. The Joker has been cured of his madness and is now sane. The Clown Prince of Crime has changed his ways, fighting for good in Gotham City, and it may just cause Batman to go over the edge of his own sanity. And I will say this comic run was probably one of my favorite recent Batman comic runs that I ever read. And by recent, I mean like 5 years ago, but it is not that old. 5 years is still a long time. But yeah, I really enjoyed this particular comic run a lot because, the whole plot of Joker being cured and him being Jack Napier and running for, I believe it was councilman or mayor. I don't remember what the political position was. It was a very interesting take on this story. And I really loved that plot. And I also love some of the designs of how he drew some of his vehicles in this story, especially his Batmobile, which I do have the Mcfarlane version of his Batmobile. I don't know how I'm going to review that thing because it's very big and it doesn't fit this table at the moment. So in the future, I will talk about that Batmobile. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, let's talk about some of the accessories that he includes. And he has 3 different accessories. Let's start with this first one. He does come with his grapnel launcher. And it's a very interesting looking one because, the way he holds it is not the same as the usual, like, grapple gun style with like a gun handle. So I do like this. He also comes with a tied up rope with the batarang. So that goes on the figure, like he carries it, which is also interesting. And he also comes with this longer one, which is meant to go on the grapnel launcher, I think. No, not grapnel. I keep saying grapnel. It's grapple, I believe. So it's supposed to go on it like this, like it looks like he's supposed to shoot this out. I think that's what this is for. To this day, I don't really know what this is for as an accessory, but I think it's supposed to go together like this. So, be creative, have your own imagination, right? And that's pretty much it for his accessories. Oh, and of course the DC stand, if you want to count that as well. The basic ones that we've been getting all this time. So there's that. And now let's talk about the figure and the aesthetics. I really love how this figure came out. Like, being my first DC Multiverse figure, I'm going to be honest, I'm going to have some biases here where I say that I love this figure the most because it's my first one. And I will talk about the things I don't like as well. So I will point those out as well. It's not a perfect figure, but seeming that this is the only version of this comic design we'll ever see in figure form, it is probably the best one. So I like the fact that his head is sculpted this way. I like that it captures the source material of what he looks like in the comic book art. It just feels like he walked out of the pages of the comic book. And if you've seen Sean Gordon Murphy's art style of how he draws this character, it really does look like Mcfarlane at the time when they made this figure. They just literally just made a three-dimensional version of him, like he just walked out of the comic book. That's what this figure looks like to me, And I like the way that they did this head sculpt. I really like that. And I like the collar thing here because, most of the time when Batman wears his cape, there is no collar. And the collar vibe here reminds me a little bit of like the Batman design from, I think it was from, what was it from actually? Was it from Gotham by Gaslight? I don't remember the name of the source material of that, but there's like another version of the Batman story where he's like living in the 1800s, if you know what I'm talking about. So it kind of reminds me of that. And the way his mouth is like printed on here, the way it's drawn, it's so interesting. Like, it's not your usual sculpted mouth like some of the other figures we've seen. It's very comic booky, and that's what I like about this figure. It's like so comic booky. And I like the sculpting of the bat emblem. It's very different from your usual bat emblem. There's a lot of lines on here that are sculpted. It's just very different. It does kind of remind me a little bit of like that Frank Miller style, but just like in a skinnier way, like a big giant bat logo, but more rectangular and longer. I like the sculpting of his torso here. I like the sculpting of his musculature. And the belt down here is just so interesting too, because it's not like your usual Batman utility belt. It's very thick, and it's all yellow as well. And of course, it goes all the way to the back of the figure, as you can see. So there's that. And now, speaking of the cape, I do like the way that this cape came out. And, when I bought this figure at the time, I was very surprised that this cape was like soft PVC. I didn't have a lot of action figures. I didn't know the ins and out of action figures, like what made them good, what made them bad. And I didn't know that soft, PVC existed like this for like plastic capes. I did not know that this existed. So this was very interesting material to me at the time when I took this figure out of the box for the first time. And one thing I do like about this belt is the fact that there are a lot of details here. However, it is not, painted in the best way. It's just all painted in yellow. If you're a customizer, you definitely could, go back and do some touches to it. And as you can see in the source material, he does have a few other things on this belt. And speaking of the accessory, let me take one of those accessories. So basically, as you can see right here, there's like this little hook right here. All you do is you just put this on, and that's how he carries his rope thing here. So you can do that as well. It's not the best. It's soft plastic, it holds onto it. But, from some angles, if you're doing some photos, this is like to move, and sometimes it will fall off if you're not careful. So, yeah, I usually don't have that accessory on him because, you know, it just falls off very easily. And he does have a knife. I think that's a knife. Yeah, that looks like a knife. It's not removable. It is a pre-sculpted knife. And this is the one thing I don't like about this figure is the fact that this knife is pre-sculpted. I wish he actually included an actual knife. And there was, like, somewhere on the figure for him to store it. Or maybe on the belt, right? And the reason why I don't like this knife accessory here being pre-molded is because if you're doing articulation with this figure, it does kind of warp the knife handle. And mine is kind of warped, as you can see. Trying to let it focus here. Yeah, it's a little bit warped. But, you know, not too bad. But yeah, then down here by the legs, it's very simple. He's wearing very interesting armor bits for his, you know, pants, because these are definitely armor parts. I don't think they're like part of the spandex. They look like armor. And even in the source material here, I think it is leg armor or something. Kind of looks like it, right? So there's that. Pretty neat. And, you know, I like the grid lines here that are also on it. So, yeah. It's very simple. Again, there's not like crazy details going on. It's a very simplistic looking costume. But for the details that exist and for the sculpting that does exist, I love it. And this is the reason why I started collecting these figures, was because the sculpting, the detail, and the paints were there in the beginning. And, you know, one of the reasons why I didn't collect a lot of the or collect any, actually, because I don't have any of them, the Mattel DC figures, was because I just wasn't interested in those figures at the time. And also in that current mindset, I wasn't really interested in collecting action figures. But when I saw these figures that he was making, you know, Mcfarlane, it was just a whole different thing for me. Like, I was just very interested in them. And they looked cool. And look, we all have our own opinions on what figures we like and what figures we don't like. I know some people out there are very into the Mattel stuff. They grew up with the Mattel stuff. And, you know, I respect that. I didn't grow up with the Mattel figures at all. I never had any in my collection. I never really had much DC figures at all. I did have like a few Batman figures from here and there. I don't know if they were made by Mattel. I don't remember. But, you know, I didn't grow up with a lot of DC figures. I barely had much Batman figures or Superman figures. And the majority of my DC shelf is because of this line. So this is why this figure is like so sentimental to me, because it's my very first figure from this line. And, you know, coming from someone who read this comic and appreciated the story for what it was, this is my favorite Batman figure. Like, if I had to do like a tier list for like what my favorite Batman figures are from this line, this one no doubt would be the first one. And then the second one would probably be the Arkham Knight Batman. So, okay. That's basically all the aesthetics I can talk about with this figure. And yeah, I think, like, you know, for a figure from 5 years ago, this thing was sculpted very nicely. Like, it was walking out of the comic pages. I don't think they did a bad job with this. And because there's no other version of this figure made by any other company to compare it to, it is probably the best version of the White Knight Batman we'll ever get. I don't know if there'll ever be another version of this made by a different company, and if there is, maybe they could probably do it better. Who knows? But for the time being, this is probably the best one. And I know for a fact that this figure is very sought after because, you know, these White Knight figures are probably the best ones that they made at the time. So, all right, let's talk about articulation. And this is where I am probably going to talk about the flaws that I don't like about this figure. And that is, you know, the cape right here. So, they could have molded this cape a little bit differently where it didn't have to cover his shoulders because, you know, when this happens, your articulation is so limited, right? Like, you can see that he can't really get his arms out too much. Like, he can spread it out to kind of like a T-pose, but not like completely. He does have a butterfly joint in there, but for some reason, my copy of this figure, those joints don't really work. They just stay stiff, and there's no point of them working at all when the arm is not going to really move out too much, right? And single jointed arms. So, at the time, I didn't really mind the whole single jointed arms because I wasn't really familiar with like action figure articulation too much. So I was like, oh, it's fine. But for a single jointed arm, I think the range of motion for this arm was pretty good at the time. And it was also ratcheted too, which is interesting because a lot of joints now are not like this. This was a ratcheted arm joint, which is kind of surprising because, the legs are not ratcheted. And that was also another interesting thing right there is that did they have to make the single jointed? Like, why couldn't this be double jointed? But if you look at the source material of how his arm is, maybe if it was double jointed, it probably might look a little bit weird. I don't know. But, I don't mind the single joint on this figure. And you also have this upper bicep swivel, right? You have articulation in the hands as well, which is really good. You also have articulation right there. So, I think for a arm articulation, it's not too bad. As far as head articulation, let me actually zoom out. It's looking up. Like, he can look up pretty good. So, that's not too bad. And, what's interesting about this figure, too, is that this is the first time this company has ever made articulation for their figures better. Because for a while now, I've known that Mcfarlane, when it comes to articulation for their figures, was quite lackluster, right? Like, they don't do good articulation. But one thing I like about the DC Multiverse line from them was the fact that it pushed them to improve their articulation. And look, is their articulation on these figures like the best? No, it's not like the best articulation, but at least it made them improve what they were making before. So that's the one thing I like about these figures. And can you look down? Yeah, kind of. Well, not exactly, actually. The neck joint and the way that his front part of his face is sculpted, he's not really going to be looking down too much unless you lean the torso. And this is where the articulation for the torso area is not the best for this figure. It's, like for my copy, it's still very stiff, right, as you can see. And if you're trying to ab crunch, it doesn't really ab crunch that much. Now, if you're trying to lean back, it can lean back really good, kinda. So there's that. For his legs, he does kick out pretty decently, I guess, if you want to call it that. He does double joint, so that's pretty good. And it can go like a full way, of course. So if you want to get him into a pose, you can do that as well. And for his feet, it does articulate that way as well. It does have a hinge. It does swivel. And he can spread out his legs pretty freaking good. I do like that. So, most of the articulation on this figure is pretty much your standard Mcfarlane articulation that they've been incorporating for quite a long time. And again, I really like the way that this figure came out because it's just, the sculpting that they put into this one really showed that they cared, that they really wanted to capture the source material to the best that they could. And looking back at this figure now, 5 years, for a 5-year-old figure, because that's what it is, it's pretty old. It's pretty freaking good still. It's still a good figure that holds up even after all this time, and I really like that. I don't know what else to say about this. I'm just really happy to be looking back at this figure today. It's one of my favorite Batman figures, and yeah. All right, let me show how this grapple launcher goes on his hand. So, as you can see right here with his finger, it is a trigger finger. It's a very interesting trigger finger because, this thing is not really the shape of a gun. So, let me try to put this in his hand so I can show what I'm talking about. So, basically what you want to do is you kind of want to like, you know, put this in. And you gotta want to put it in a way where he's holding it like this, because you're supposed to have that part in between his fingers, as you can see. So you can see right there. Hope the camera's picking that up. So that's how he holds it. And unfortunately, this figure does not have interchangeable hands. I wish he had another pair of fist hands, which would have made it cooler. So you can do some cool action poses with him. But yeah, that was the one thing with a lot of these figures at the beginning, was that, you know, some of them didn't come with interchangeable hands. So yeah, but that is basically everything to this White Knight Batman. And now I want to compare him to the other version that they made after. And, you know, it is really a shame that when they made the Batmobile finally for this figure, they decided not to re-release this figure, which I think was a bad idea for them, because, you know, there's a lot of people that actually want this figure, right? And they did re-release this figure in like different styles. And the crazy part was, when they released that Batmobile, they were like, oh yeah, you can still buy this bundle. You can get this version. You know, this is the one from the, I think it was the second comic run where he was fighting Azrael and he had his swords. But this version is, you know, it's the same body and everything, but people wanted him with the cape. And I think it was a missed opportunity for Mcfarlane to not, you know, re-release this version with the cape. It would have sold out like fast. I know for a fact it would. So it's really sad that, you know, they didn't ever reissue this figure, and I hope they do going forward in the future. I really hope that they find a way to put this figure out again, because for those of you who missed out on this White Knight Batman figure, I think you guys deserve a chance to get this as well. Of course, the proper one. You know, this one's cool and all, but, you know, the one with the cape is the best one. So, and unfortunately, my copy of this, like, other version, his legs are freaking loose. I don't know what happened here. Like, it's so loose. Like, it was like this when it came out of the box. So, it's like a quality control issue. So, I don't even, like, display this figure at all on the shelf because of how bad his legs are. And maybe in the future, if I can get another copy of this, hopefully I won't have this problem. But, you know, yeah, that's the one that I don't display. This is the one that I like displaying on my shelf, because this is the costume that I prefer him in with the cape. So, all right. Well, if you found today's look at an older Mcfarlane DC Multiverse figure informative in the case of this White Knight Batman, I hope you give this video a like if you enjoyed it. If you want to subscribe to the channel for more action figure content and whatever else I do on the channel, you can subscribe. You don't have to. In the end of the day, I make these videos for fun. And with that said, take care, and I will see you in the next video.